Okay, so we are in the content of the book of Proverbs. Last week we began the fourth section of the content. I added a fifth, so this is not the final section that Dave has. But we are discussing fools. And last week, as I recall, we started this question: what characteristics of fools are emphasized in the following passages of Proverbs? And if my recollection is correct, we finished the first two. Proverbs 20 and verse 1, which is talking about those who partake in intoxicating beverages as being described as fools. And then we discussed Proverbs 18 verses 6 and 7, one who gets his mouth into trouble, one who can't control his tongue, as being one who would be described as a fool. So let's start this morning's class with Proverbs chapter 6, verses 32 to 35. We're going to start with Henry at the back. Why don't you get verses 32 to 35 of Proverbs 6?
Whoever commits adultery with a woman next understand, and he who does so destroy his own soul. Wounds and dishonor will be offense, and his reproach will not wiped out. For jealousy is as children, and therefore he will not spare in the day of vengeance. He will accept no recompense, nor will he appease the soul you feel many.
So who is the fool in this passage? Who is described as the fool here? One who commits adultery. This is often when we deal with adultery, we deal with it as sin, and it is sin. Sometimes some people might try to minimize it as just being something that is so common in this world that we sort of slough it off as not significant. But the writer here in Proverbs tells us something about the attitude of the one who commits adultery. How is he described here? Henry says he lacks understanding, true understanding. Why does he lack understanding? Why is he the fool here? The verse does tell us. What happens to him? He destroys his own soul. Adultery is a sin that will separate us from God. So in that sense, he destroys his own soul. And if we do not repent of that, we would be condemned. But it also destroys family life. Take a look at the condition of family in this world, and we say, well, children, they're not as they're rebellious. They're more rebellious than they used to be, and the divorce rates are sky high, and we don't have maybe a reason. Well, adultery is one of those reasons. Faithfulness to your spouse. People don't take wedding vows seriously today. It's just a formality that you go through in sickness and health, and in poor, like as far as poor or rich or whatever it is, like all the vows. People don't take them seriously. And that's why divorce rates are higher, because we easy marry, easy divorce, and really no thought about it. And if our spouse is not pleasing us at home, well, we'll go and be with someone else. That's the attitude that people in this world have. It's an attitude we should not have. Those who commit adultery lack understanding. He that does it destroys his own soul in many ways, in many more ways than one. Jeff, did you have something?
Yeah, the way it's worded, he's not counting the cost for that moment.
Yeah.
Because everything is, here's what will happen.
Yeah.
He doesn't stop and consider.
Yeah. Well, and adultery sometimes is a spur of the moment thing. You see a woman, or a woman sees a man, and they are overcome with lust, and then one thing leads to another, and they haven't really thought about it. And sometimes the consequences go even further. You bring a child into this world because of it. Has everything to do with not counting the cost and not thinking. And I would put in here those who commit fornication would be in the same condition as far as those who they aren't thinking about the consequences. And when they're not thinking about the consequences, when they're just living in the moment, then trouble, well, I'll deal with that later. And that's often the attitude of people. Well, it might be a little dangerous, but I'll deal with that later. Right now it's fun. Right now I'm having a good time. The person who commits adultery is described as a fool. And we should be avoiding that. We do not want to be called fools. Let's get Proverbs 24. Sherry, why don't you get Proverbs 24, 30, and 31? Annie can get 31 through 34. So Proverbs 24. Sherry will get 30 and 31, and then Annie will get 32 to 34. So, who is the fool here? Pardon me?
The sluggard.
The sluggard. What word might we use today? Lazy. Lazy. The slothful, the sluggard, the lazy person is a fool. This is something we don't often talk about. We talk about adultery. We talk about drunkenness. We talk about our mouths getting into trouble, but we don't really talk about laziness. And what are we talking about when we're talking about laziness? Is it just not wanting to get up in the morning on a given Saturday? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, it is if you have something to do.
It is if you have something to do, but some people say, well, sleeping in, that I'm not being lazy by that. It is if you have something to do. You're right, Bill. But what are we talking about? And Bill sort of alluded to it. Doing, like as far as not being willing to work. Laziness is not being willing to work. You are finding ways to avoid work, or you are maybe involving yourself with other people. You're being busybodies or gossips. You're finding ways to procrastinate. Laziness is not just maybe a one-time thing, like as far as this is a habitual laziness. If I wake up one morning and I have nothing to do, and so I decide to sleep for an extra hour, that's not laziness. But if I promise someone I'm going to be someplace and I'm going to help them do something, I better live by what I've said. And we need to find things to do, because when we don't have things to do, that's when we get ourselves into trouble. When we are constantly trying to avoid any responsibility, anything for us to accomplish, that's when our thoughts drift, or we go and do some things that we shouldn't do, because after all, I had nothing to do. Callie, you had something to say.
The way how it is described it here too. If you look at someone's house and you see the grass growing all over the place, if the lawn needs cutting, some things are broken down, people not trying to make an effort to fix it. and so on. You could tell. I mean, in summertime you see this too. Most
Yeah. And
idle and waste and no ambition, no pride.
Mhm.
You know, take pride in what the Lord bless you with.
as far as we should be glad with what the Lord has blessed us with and be willing to take care of it. Sometimes there are reasons why certain things don't get done, but if we come over, your house is falling apart and you're just sitting around, what's wrong here? I just didn't feel like doing it. That's a lazy attitude. And when it comes to being a Christian, we shouldn't have a lazy attitude as well. Why didn't we teach the gospel? I just didn't feel like it. We shouldn't have a lazy attitude as a Christian either. Not just with our physical lives, but with our spiritual lives. We say, I'm weak in certain areas. Well, are you studying? Well, no. Why not? I don't know. Like as far as we shouldn't be lazy in our spiritual lives either. So these are remember, being called a fool in Proverbs is not just a light rebuke. A fool lacks wisdom, lacks God's wisdom. And if we are called fools, let's not think God will just accept us. Being a fool is sinning. Being a fool is being involved in sin. And so anything that we read of as being foolish, let's avoid that. Because God doesn't, we should not want God to call us a fool. If He has given us wisdom, let's use that. Any other comments before we move on from fools? Well, if not, we will go to my added section. I think Dave had about two sentences in here about this next section, which is called the virtuous woman. And I felt that if a look at Proverbs is not really complete if you don't deal with the last chapter, because the last chapter is important in dealing with some of the people who accuse the Bible of being anti-woman, of saying that women are worthless, or women are slaves, or women need to do this, or women need to do that. Well, the Bible does deal with women. In fact, it deals with them in a very good light. Yes, there are some things that women are not to do, but there are some things that men aren't to do either. So let's not come along and say, well, the Bible is just restraining women. The Bible restrains men too. And the virtuous woman is a good reminder about what women should be. And so let's read Proverbs 31. It's starting at verse 10 and goes through the entire rest of the chapter, which is the rest of the book. And so we'll start up with Tim. Why don't we read 2 verses each? We'll go from Tim and then up to Gloria and Jeff and around. Proverbs 31, 10 through 31.
How many
2 verses each, yeah. Starting at verse 10.
Who can find a virtuous wife? For her words is found above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, and so he will have no lack of faith.
She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and willingly works with her hands.
She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. She also rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and a portion for her maidservants.
She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong.
She senses that her game is good. Her lamp does not go out at night. She stretches out her hands with the staff, and her hands grasp the spindle.
She extends her hand to the poor, and she stretches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of the snow, for all her household included with scarlet.
and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come.
I think we'll move up to Henry now.
So Miss Monroe, with wisdom, and until come is the law of kindness. So watch over the ways of your husband, does not eat the bread of your neighbor.
So my question, which I have made, is what makes the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31 virtuous? First of all, what is virtue? What might we ask? What is virtue?
The characteristic or trait to have, to possess.
Okay, and what kind of trait is it?
Godly.
Pardon me?
Godly, respecting God
Godly?
and human society.
Okay, and we get purity from that. Do you have something?
Excellence or purity.
Excellence or purity, respecting God. All of those things. So what makes this woman virtuous? To be an example for other people. And there are many things. I'm not looking for just one answer because there's 21 verses on it. What makes her virtuous?
Well, first of all, it talks about all the things she does. So she's definitely not a fool, meaning idle. She is very busy. I don't know if she sleeps and when she sleeps, because the amount of things she does, apart from holding her husband in high esteem, they always said, look at a man and it will reflect on the woman. You know, so,
Yeah.
I mean, I heard that saying a long time, and people will look at a woman and blame the woman. I mean, if the man's wearing old clothes or shirt not ironed or something like that, and she's
Cord.
she's always busy doing things, not only for herself, for her mates, for her servants. I mean, this is incredible.
I think you hit it right on the nose. She's not. She exemplifies what Jesus says. She puts others ahead of herself. She's looking out for her husband, for her children, for the people who work for her. She's virtuous in that way. And she's hardworking. That verse 27, she does not eat of the bread of idleness. She does exactly what we had just discussed, that she was not that. She was not lazy. She found things to do. What else makes her virtuous? Of all the things she did, what characteristics maybe do we find here? What was the first real thing that in verse 11 that talks about? It's a trait that we all should have.
Trust. Your husband trust her.
Trustworthiness. That's what makes her virtuous to begin with. She is trusted of her husband, not to do the things that she was supposed to do, to behave the way she was supposed to behave. And I would come along and hope the wife would trust her husband the same way. It is a relationship built on trust. Marriage should be a relationship built on trust. Shouldn't have to worry about what the husband or the wife is going out doing. Shouldn't have to worry about the husband or the wife going out and being with another woman or another man. You trust them. Shouldn't have to worry about if the wife or the husband says, oh, I'm going to do that, that they do that. She's trustworthy to do what she is supposed to do. Jeff?
Well, her life is not exactly the same as every woman's life.
No.
For example, she has a husband
Yes.
and children. Not every woman would.
No.
But what I'm impressed with is every part of her life, it seems she is focused on virtue,
Mm-hmm.
and excellence, and purity in every aspect of her
Mm-hmm.
life. So, I look at this woman and I say, well, whatever her situation may be, whether she was married or wasn't married, however she conducted herself, she would always be looking for that purity in whatever she does.
Yeah, and that's a good point that you made about marriage in specifics. A woman can be virtuous without being married, but can still do almost everything else that's involved here. Yeah, you won't be trusted by your husband. You don't have one, but you should be trustworthy. Yeah, you won't have children to look after, but maybe you have other people to look after, and maybe someone else's children from time to time. Just because a woman is not married doesn't mean she is not virtuous. She can be virtuous, and she is to be virtuous, even unmarried, and it's not even coming along and saying a woman should be married. God in the beginning said it was not good for man to be alone, but it was never a command that men and women had to marry. It was recommended because it is not good for us to be alone. We are a companion type of people. God created us that way, but it is not commanded. But we can still be virtuous. Jeff and then Bill.
I wasn't referring just.
No, I understand. I understand
like,
what you're saying.
Not every woman's going to buy a baby.
No.
But everybody will be busy and industrious in something.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Well, it was industrious. In whatever. Yeah, she bought a vineyard, and that's sort of, we come along and say, well, yeah, you don't have to buy vineyards, but you can be industrious in other ways. And whatever way fits into your situation. You can be industrious in many ways. But in this case, she was industrious because she needed a vineyard. Obviously, that was something that they needed. And so that's something that she did. And she was industrious in that way. Bill.
That's all well and true, but it's good to know too. It begins by saying these are the words of the king.
Yeah.
So her son was the king, and the credit was given to her. Raising children is a lot harder than dealing with young people that you meet and you're friends with. But the credit here is given to her, the fact that he's a king. So her instruction enabled him to have the wisdom to be a king.
And she was a virtuous woman. There are some who I don't disagree with you. There are some people who see sort of a break between verses 9 and 10 and wonder if this entire chapter is that. I'm not one of them, but it doesn't matter either way.
No.
It doesn't matter either way. If it was the words of King Lemuel that his mother taught him about what a virtuous woman was, and whether or not the context changed, that's a good point.
Even if it does change, the first part's for months.
Yeah.
The second part,
Yeah.
for single women.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So this is what I had. A virtuous woman in this specific chapter is trustworthy, seeks to do good for her husband, should she be married, hardworking, industrious, kind. She is good with money. In other words, she doesn't waste her money. She doesn't let her money sit idle and do nothing. She puts her money to work. Remember in the parable of the talents, Jesus told this parable, and the king left these talents with people, and the person who did nothing with their talents was a person who Jesus had a problem with. When we are blessed, we should use what God has blessed us with for the good of others and the good of ourselves last, but the good of others. And so if God has blessed us in many different ways and we just waste away what God has given us, that's not an attitude we're to have. This woman is good with money. She's generous with her what she is given. Her maids and maidens don't live, it seems to me, the poor life. They are servants, but they're well treated. because they're her servants. She seeks to make sure that her family is well taken care of. She's wise and not lazy, and she fears God. She does all of those things, and then we find what happens. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also praises her. That's what happens when a woman behaves the way she's supposed to. And a husband should behave similarly as well. But it's mom, notice here, who's described this way. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband praises her. It says, many daughters have done virtuously, but you excel them all. The virtuous woman does that. And notice here, the last thing is she's not concerned, and people are not concerned with her outward appearance, because that fades away. A virtuous woman can be old and still be virtuous, even if her youthful beauty is gone. We all get old. We lose our hair, we get wrinkles, we may not look the same as we did when we were younger, but that should not change our attitude, our virtue, our fear of God. And people should not be concerned with those outward looks, because they fade away. And so if all of our relationship is based on outward appearance, that's when we get into trouble later in life, because beauty fades. So I'm going to cast away my older wife and get a younger wife. That's not what we're to do. And let's get one more verse before, and if Bill has something, we'll get to him in a second. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 9 and 10 describes a widow, and about a widow being a widow indeed, and how this widow, if the church was to support her, because she did not have any family, how she's described. Tim, you want to get 1 Timothy 5, verses 9 and 10.
The one that a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been a wife of one man, well reported for good works. If she has brought up children, if she has housed strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the feast, if she has diligently followed every good work.
So, another, does this sound like a virtuous widow? Yeah, it does. Sounds a lot like what we read in Proverbs 31. Now, we're not going to deal with the specifics here of relieving widows. I was looking for the behavior of this woman. She lodged strangers. She washed the saints' feet. She relieved the afflicted. Same sort of woman that we find in Proverbs 31. She did what needed to be done. Women are to guide the home. The husband is the head of the home. But the scriptures teach women are to guide the home. Doesn't mean you have to stay at home. The virtuous woman didn't just stay in the home. The virtuous woman went out and did what needed to be done. Her husband obviously worked as well. But she wasn't just homekeeping, staying at home. She went out. She bought things. She worked hard. And that's what a virtuous woman is. I think you had something, Bill, before.
Well, just verse 23 spoke of her husband.
Yeah.
So that speaks of her respect and honor for her husband. She knew where he was supposed to be and what his duties were, and so she encouraged that.
Yeah. I believe here we find a family unit that understands God's plan, God's intentions for marriage. And when one spouse or the other doesn't do what God has said, the house doesn't run properly. When the husband doesn't lead the household has a problem. When the wife doesn't guide the household has a problem. When the children don't obey their parents, the household has a problem. When all pull their own weight, do exactly what they're supposed to do. Obviously, this woman taught her children as well. And her husband taught their children as well how to behave properly. This is a virtuous woman. This is a fitting close to the book of Proverbs. It is wise to behave like this woman. And so that brings us to our overview, our outline. And really the outline can be taken in 5 sections. We begin with the Proverbs of Solomon. They really take the first 24 chapters of the book of Proverbs. The majority of the Proverbs that we have are written by Solomon. Then we have, in section 2, those Proverbs that were written by Solomon, but they were later compiled by Hezekiah's scribes. We read that in, I think it was 2 Kings, that Hezekiah's scribes did this, and Proverbs 25 says so, that some of the Proverbs were compiled later. Then we really didn't discuss the words of Agur, but chapter 30, verses 1 to 33, are his words. So these aren't Solomon's words in chapter 30. And then we have the words of King Lemuel. And if we discuss the virtuous woman, and King Lemuel was the one who wrote that, we discussed a lot of his words. But the first 10 verses, or 9 verses of this chapter also deal with the life of a king and what a king is to do. Wise sayings of King Lemuel. And then we have the praise of the virtuous woman, is the last section of Proverbs. All of these have to do with one word: wisdom. The book of Proverbs is a book of wisdom. Wise sayings of Solomon. The wise sayings of Solomon compiled by Hezekiah scribe. The wise sayings of Agur. The wise sayings of King Lemuel. All of these are wise sayings. And they're not just good bumper stickers or good fortune cookie wisdom. They're actual wisdom from God. These are inspired proverbs. These are how God would have us behave. And if we follow how God would have us behave, our lives will be much better, because we will understand how to overcome the problems that we face in this life. We won't have the problems of alcoholism because we won't be drinking. We won't have the problems of lack of self-control over our tongue because we will have learned how to control it. We won't have the problems of lust and adultery because we will avoid those things, knowing what God has told us. All of these things are wise, and we should heed them. Any other comments before we close with Proverbs? Jeff?
You mentioned Proverbs from God, wise words from God. It's interesting, Ezekiel 18 reminded me that the people of Israel in Ezekiel 18 were using a proverb that wasn't God's.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
Yes.
I said, what do you mean when you use this proverb? The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. God says, you shall no longer use this proverb.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be careful of wise things that people say commonly, that when you examine them, they're not wise,
No.
and they're not godly.
No.
They just seem.
Well, and some things sound like they are from the Bible and are not. And in fact, my dad often says some things you read in Proverbs that you didn't know was from the Bible that we commonly use as Proverbs today. We need to know the difference between God's Proverbs and earthly Proverbs. Earthly Proverbs may not be wrong. However, they're not inspired, so we better make sure that they are right. As Jeff alluded to, that just because it is a proverb doesn't make it right, just because we call it a proverb. And so that's a good point. Well, we will move on to the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is one of those books when I have to write out the entire word, it's tough. Because as far as this, Ecclesiastes is harder to spell. 2 C's, 3 S's, and you have to know where they all are. Ecclesiastes is the 21st book, of the Old Testament, and it is the 4th out of 5 Old Testament books of wisdom or inspired poetry. We've dealt with Job. We've dealt with Psalms. We've dealt with Proverbs. This is Ecclesiastes, and Lord willing, Bill will be teaching the 5th book, Song of Solomon, in this poetry section right here. So Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Now, Ecclesiastes is one of the most philosophical books in the Old Testament. Philosophical meaning the nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. It's philosophy, but unlike worldly philosophy, this is godly philosophy. Solomon here is again, and I know I'm going to deal with the answering a question, but Solomon again here is the writer. And so this is inspired of God. It addresses the vanity of earthly pursuits when God is not the center of one's life. In other words, if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, you will find the word vanity a lot in that. And it describes different things that are vain, that are useless without God. If God is not the center of our life, this life existence is rather useless. Think about it. You're born, you grow up, you get a job, you may get married, you grow old, you retire, and then you die. What a useless existence if God is not there. What's the point? And it's really vain if God's not the center of our life. The phrase that also occurs along with vanity is the phrase under the sun. And it occurs 29 times in this book. And it refers to life as viewed from a human perspective or an observation, in contrast to life as directed by God's instruction. So when we talk about under the sun, well, we are under the sun. The sun is in the sky. It looks like we are under it. And so it is that phrase. We do want to get Ecclesiastes 12. It's very quick. Jeff, do you want to get Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14? So Ecclesiastes chapter 12. We're going to start at the end of the book, verses 13 and 14.
Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So, again, we discuss what is the purpose of life, and we'll deal with this more later. It is the conclusion of the whole matter. If God is not the center of our life, is not the center of our instruction, we have a problem. Because God will be judging us based on what he said. He'll bring every work, everything we do into judgment, whether it's secret or done in the open, whether it's good or bad. And so the phrase under the sun is really a contrasting. What are we doing in our lives compared to what God has instructed us with? And so next week, the Lord willing, we will be discussing the origin of Ecclesiastes. And this is our famous section. We'll be discussing the title, the author, and the date of this book, and then go on into the purpose and the content of Ecclesiastes as well.